Venezuela is out of food. After several years of long lines, rationing, and shortages, the socialist country does not have enough food to feed its population, and the opposition government has declared a nutritional emergency. This is just the most recent nail in the beleaguered country's slow, painful economic collapse. Many people expect an economic collapse to be shocking, instant, and dramatic, but, really, it's far more gradual than that. It looks like empty shelves, long lines, desperate government officials trying to cover their tushes, and hungry people. For the past 2 years, I've been following the situation in Venezuela as each shocking event has unfolded. Americans who feel that our country would be better served by a socialist government would be wise to take note of this timeline of the collapse. Many began to suspect that the outlook for Venezuela was grim when prepping became illegal. The Attorney General of Venezuela, Luisa Ortega Diaz, called on prosecutors to target people who are hoarding basic staples with serious sanctions. Shortly thereafter, grocery stores instituted a fingerprint registry to purchase food and supplies. Families had to register and were allotted a certain amount of supplies to prevent hoarding. Then, just over a year ago, it became even more apparent that the country was falling when long lines for basic necessities such as laundry soap, diapers, and food became the norm rather than the exception. Thousands of people were standing in line for 5 to 6 hours in the hopes that they would be able to purchase a few much-needed items. Shortly after the story broke to the rest of the world, the propaganda machine shifted into high gear. As the government began to ration electricity, it was announced that this was not due to economic reasons at all, but instead was a measure of their great concern for the environment. As the situation continued to devolve, farmers in Venezuela were forced to hand over their crops last summer. They assumed control of essential goods like food, and began putting retail outlets out of business. Then, once they had control of the sales outlets, they began forcing farmers and food manufacturers to sell anywhere from 30 to 100% of their products to the state at the price the state opted to pay, as opposed to stores and supermarkets. But that wasn't enough to keep the population fed. Isn't it astonishing how much less motivated people are to produce food and supplies when they are no longer allowed to benefit from their hard work? Historically, collectivism and farming have never gone successfully hand in hand. This January, the government told citizens that they would need to produce their own food. The Ministry of Urban Farming was created to oversee this. While self-reliance sounds great, it isn't so great in Venezuela. Just so the urban farmers don't get too self-reliant, a registry of the crops and livestock will be required. And obviously, they've already proven that they have no issue forcing farmers to hand over what they've produced. Now, it looks like all of the socialist measures and forced food production haven't been enough to keep the people of Venezuela fed. The country is in so much trouble now that it isn't possible to cover it up with propaganda. Socialist legislators are hoping to manipulate the initiative in the other direction, and use it to expand government control of private food enterprises. Legislator Hector Rodriguez has insisted that the economic emergency does absolutely nothing, and the government should impose itself on private enterprises. Another socialist legislator, Ricardo Molina, is calling for the government to expropriate Polar, Venezuela's largest private food corporation. We have to intervene on private sector enterprises. Venezuela previously forced a Polar food distribution center in Caracas to shut down in July, putting 12,000 tons of food, 6 million liters of soft drinks, and 2,000 jobs at risk. Venezuela is suffering the worst economic crisis in its history. Ordinary people in the oil-rich country are regularly going without food. 3/4 empty supermarkets are being ransacked by angry, hungry mobs. The government has declared a state of emergency, food is now being transported under armed guard, and basic necessities are being rationed. People have to queue for hours and sometimes overnight on their assigned days to receive staples like rice and cooking oil. We are like a bomb. Food riots show Venezuela crisis has gone beyond politics. Read more. By IMF figures, it has the world's worst negative growth rate, -8%, and the worst inflation rate, 482%. The unemployment rate is 17% but is expected to climb to near 30% in the coming few years. The shadow of hunger, the desperation of the crowds and the spread of unrest and criminality threaten the government of Nicolas Maduro, 3 years after he was bequeathed power by the dying revolutionary strongman, Hugo Chavez. The opposition has launched a drive to canvass signatures for a petition for him to step down. That will be a difficult task in the face of a state-run electoral system determined to thwart it, but the state may implode even if the recall referendum fails. How did such an oil-rich state collapse so catastrophically? The Maduro government has blamed the crisis on the U.S. and right-wing business owners who it accuses of cutting production to sabotage the economy, but Maduro has inherited a ruinous state-run system from Chavez to which economists say he has added some damaging mistakes of his own. Chavez built his popularity on oil money and foreign debt, using both to fund consumption, while nationalizing more than 1,200 private companies deemed not to be functioning in the public interest. But in 2015 the oil price was cut in half and Venezuela's reckless public finances helped make it a high-risk debtor, cutting the country's access to international capital. The Maduro government has responded to the consequent hole in public finances by printing money, fueling inflation. It's estimated that the cost of basic groceries that would keep a family going through a week increased by more than 25% between March and April, and now costs 22 times the state minimum salary. The state has tried to ration basic foodstuffs and set their prices, but the consequence is they have simply disappeared from the shops into the black market. The opposition says the direct distribution of food has been politicized by being channeled through local committees run by Maduro's United Socialist Party of Venezuela. According to Transparency International, Venezuela is the 9th most corrupt country in the world. Members of Maduro's family and immediate entourage have been implicated in drug smuggling and hundreds of billions of dollars are believed to have been siphoned out of the economy. The crisis is likely to get even worse in the near future. The government has been running through the country's gold reserves to pay its international debt service and finance at least some basic imports, but those reserves are now dwindling, and Maduro will either have to default or stop importing food. Both options are potentially catastrophic. Will Maduro be brought down by the recall referendum? The opposition have put high hopes in a referendum, and launched a signature drive in April, but Venezuela's National Electoral Council, CNE, has imposed a set of high hurdles for a petition to pass before the choice can be presented to the general population. Roughly 1.3 million people signed a petition for a recall vote, far more than the 200,000 required by law, but 600,000 of the signatures have already been rejected by the CNE, and people have been queuing for hours to validate the rest of the signatures by having their fingerprints scanned. Even if they are found to have passed the required threshold of 1% of voters, that just allows them to go forward to a second petition, in which opponents would have to amass close to 4 million votes to trigger a recall vote. The Maduro camp argues the opposition have left the petition too late for a referendum this year, a claim his opponents vehemently contest. The issue of timing is critical. If Maduro is ousted after January 2017, his place can be passed to his vice president, keeping power in Socialist Party hands. The Maduro government has regional allies that have protected it from external pressure. Recently, the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, Luis Almagro, told The Guardian that Argentina had been working behind the scenes to obstruct an OAS assembly to discuss the economic crisis and human rights crises in Caracas, amid reports that the two governments had done a deal involving guaranteed Venezuelan support for Argentina's candidate for UN Secretary General, Susan Malcorra. Venezuela's other neighbors have also been accused of standing on the sidelines for either economic or ideological reasons while the country slides into chaos. The crisis may be forcing a thaw in relations with the U.S., long presented as a bogeyman by Chavez and then Maduro. The U.S. Under-Secretary of State, Thomas Shannon, flew to Caracas this week, following a meeting at the OAS between John Kerry and his counterpart, the Venezuelan Foreign Minister, Delcy Rodriguez. 5 updates on the Venezuelan economic crisis. It has been a few weeks since our last Venezuelan economy update, and economist Jean-Philippe Purslow has a new post discussing 5 updates on the Venezuelan economy, including the Bolivar's latest plunge, the results of the bond swap saga, Venezuelan oil prices, and the government's newest plans to tackle soaring inflation. 1. Bolivar nosedives to all-time low in November. The Bolivar has been depreciating sharply in the parallel market since late September, and on November 4, the Bolivar reached a new all-time low, trading in the parallel market at 1,758 VEF per USD. The result marked a 38.3% depreciation from the same day of the previous month and a massive 54.8% depreciation over the same day last year. The parallel dollar has shed 52.6% of its value since the start of the year. The depreciation of the Bolivar has coincided with the highly publicized escalation of the country's political crisis and an increase in the money supply of the economy. In our latest Latin Focus consensus forecast, we project a non-official exchange rate of 1,198 VEF per USD by the end of 2016. In 2017, with no end to the crisis in sight, we project the non-official exchange rate to depreciate further to 1,804 VEF per USD. As for the rest of the convoluted exchange rate system, the DIPRO exchange rate has remained unchanged and the free-floating DICOM has remained broadly stable. Find out how long analysts see the exchange rate system lasting in its current variation. 2. Venezuela receives a lifeline from bondholders. In other news, the bond swap saga of Venezuela's state-owned oil company, PDVSA, came to an end on October 24 with bondholders agreeing to exchange 39.4% of bonds due in 2017 after the government had modified the original swap deal, extending the deadline 4 times. Although the swap was below the 50% objective outlined by the government, it provides some much-needed short-term relief to the cash-strapped oil company as it battles low oil prices, falling production, and tight liquidity. The swap buys the PDVSA and the government time to kick its payments down the road until 2020. However, it will not do much in the way of alleviating their debt burden, nor will it solve the structural imbalances plaguing the economy. Mauro Roca, senior economist at Goldman Sachs, reflects on Venezuela's new debt payment schedule and the insufficient support the debt swap is expected to provide to the economy. The temporary relief in PDVSA external debt payments becomes even less relevant when considering total external debt payments faced by both Venezuela and PDVSA. As a result of the bond swap, external bonds payments for 2017 have been reduced to $8.10 bn from $9.12 bn, but have concurrently increased to $8.59 bn from $7.51 for 2018. Moreover, the sovereign and PDVSA still jointly face an average yearly debt service commitment of $8.7 bn until 2020. The first payments of the new 2020 bonds are due in Q4 2017, while the liquidity crunch that the country is facing shows no sign of improving. With international reserves staying at $12.0 billion at the start of October and falling to a record low $10.9 billion on October 27, the last reported figure, and oil output declining, the prospects of a default still loom large as the country has fewer economic buffers to avoid a sovereign debt default. 3. Oil prices rally to over one-year high. And speaking of oil, it does appear that the OPEC oil production deal has had a positive effect on Venezuelan oil prices, for now. In October, the average price of Venezuela's mix of crude oil rose 11.3% from the previous month to $42.60 per barrel. October's print marks the second consecutive increase in Venezuelan oil prices and the highest price reached since July 2015. The preliminary agreement made by oil-producing countries to cut output from 33.2 million barrels per day, MBPD, to 32.5 MBPD has supported oil prices since September. Statements made by Saudi Arabian officials in October on their commitment to reduce production increased confidence in the prospect of reaching a final agreement, though its ability to influence Venezuelan oil prices significantly remains to be seen. Limited cuts to output, coupled with increased production in key countries such as Nigeria and Libya, will do little to rebalance the oversupplied market. Reluctance by some countries such as Iraq to cut output also undermines efforts to reach a far-reaching agreement. Overall, the deal is unlikely to provide enough support to shore up Venezuela's public finances or alleviate the country's economic crisis. According to the latest OPEC monthly oil market report released on October 12, oil production in Venezuela has been declining consistently and is now hovering at multi-year lows. The slump in output reflects a very challenging investment climate, chronic underinvestment in industry, difficulties in importing oil diluents and the problem of outstanding payments with suppliers. The combination of depressed oil prices and falling production has raised concerns about the cash-strapped government's capacity to meet its multi-billion-dollar international debt obligations. Venezuela's capacity to circumvent a default partly hinges on whether oil prices will increase enough to improve public finances and enable the country to meet its international debt obligations due in the coming years. Latest forecasts for Venezuelan oil prices in 2016 and 2017 available here. 4. The government plans to increase wages again. And what about that little problem of skyrocketing inflation? Focus Economics consensus forecast analysts estimate that inflation jumped from 368.1% at the end of Q2 to 448.8% at the end of Q3, and indicators from official sources continue to point to mounting price pressures in the fourth quarter. With oil output declining to multi-year lows, the government has resorted to printing money to finance the deficit. According to the Central Bank of Venezuela, the money supply increased by 113.7% in September, up from 104.3% in August. In October, the government announced a 40% hike in minimum wages to keep up with soaring prices, which will be the fourth wage increase this year. According to President Maduro, minimum wages have increased by 454% since the start of this year. 5. And issue higher denomination bills to tackle inflation. In a tacit recognition of ballooning inflation, the government recently stated that larger denomination bills will start circulating in the economy at the end of the year. The government will print 20,000 VEF banknotes, 200 times higher than the current largest denomination of 200 VEF bills. The move aims to facilitate daily economic transactions in the country. In light of the above, we have the latest Venezuelan inflation forecasts for you. As always, you can count on Focus Economics to keep you updated on the Venezuelan crisis, as well as news and forecasts on 126 other countries and 33 key commodities. Visit our news page for the latest country and region economic indicator and commodity news.